All right, here we go. What happens when we have a sine function and cosine function that's not the parent function? What if I do take my function and I shift it up, I do a vertical translation, or I shift it down, or I stretch it, I do a vertical stretch or a vertical compression. It changes where the curve is located, but it doesn't change the shape of the curve. So I'm looking at a transformation here. This is a cosine curve that has been stretched and it's been shifted. The question is, where's the midline? What's the amplitude? What's the maximum? What's the minimum? What's the period? If you can figure out those 5 things from the graph, then you're on your way to figuring out the rest of the stuff, right? You have to be able to visually identify it to know what we're talking about before we introduce any of the equations that we're going to introduce. Okay, so I already see that I can label the maximum up here. So this, in a very bad, I'll just do the dash line. Here's my maximum. So my maximum is at 5. I see 6 up here, I see 4, so this must be 5. I also see the minimum. My minimum is at -1. So where is the midline? Well, it's at the exact halfway point between -1 and 5. I could count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so that's 6 steps. So if I go 3 steps from the bottom or 3 steps from the top down, I should get to the midline, right? 1, 2, 3, I'm claiming this is the midline because if I go up 1, 2, 3, it's the same number of steps. So my midline, I visually, graphically counted, and my midline is at y equals 2. Now this is different because remember our graph was shifted up and it was also stretched. I do have a formula for you, and I'm going to write it over here on the side. If you're ever needing to find the midline and you know the maximum and the minimum values, you can take the average of the maximum and minimum values. So if you add the max and min values and divide by 2, that is going to give you the midline. It's going to give you where the halfway point is. So if I added 5 plus -1, well, I'll just write it down over here, 5 plus -1, and I divided that answer by 2. 5 plus -1 is 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. Hey, that's exactly where we said the midline was going to be. Figured it out. Great. Now that I have the midline, can we figure out the amplitude? Well, the amplitude is the distance from the top to the halfway point. So either measure this, or I could also say it's the distance from the midline to the minimum point down here. It should be the same answer. And that amplitude is 1, 2, 3, 3. This amplitude should be the same thing. 1, 2, 3, 3. And I figured out my amplitude. I will share that there is a formula to find the amplitude. In order to find the amplitude, it's very similar to the midline, but I'm going to put a line here so that you don't confuse them. It's the maximum minus the minimum divided by 2. So if you think about it, if you subtract maximum minus minimum, top minus bottom, you're going to get the full distance. But if you cut it in half, you're only going to get half distance, and that's what the amplitude is. I'm going to show you with this example, 5 minus a -1 divided by 2. Remember that when you're subtracting a negative, that's really like adding a positive, so 5 minus -1 is going to give us 6. If I divide that by 2, that gives me an answer of 3. That's what we said the amplitude was. 3. The last thing we're going to find here is the period. Remember that the period is the length that it takes for the cycle to complete. I told you this was a cosine. You didn't know that, but I told you that it's a cosine. Cosine starts at the top, and it goes all the way to the top. Top, mid, bottom, mid, top, and then the pattern starts again. So these 5 points that I'm about to highlight are the main points of a cosine pattern. It's taken this long to complete the pattern. Well, if I started at 0 and I ended at 8 pi, then that length, that is the period, and the period is 8 pi. So not only did someone stretch the curve this way, they also stretched it this way, because normally the period, the time it takes for that to complete, is 2 pi. But now I can see that from start to finish, and I know that a cosine starts at the top, goes through the midline, goes to the minimum, goes back to the midline, goes back to the top. This pattern happens in a length of from 0 to 8 pi, 8 pi. We just identified the 5 things that I was asking you to think about whenever you're doing sine and cosine curves. If you can identify these 5 things, midline, amplitude, maximum, minimum, and period, you'll be able to graph any curve for sine or cosine.